Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is Argo, and today we're going to be talking just a little bit about boomer cope, and then I'm going to talk to you about why America represents the perfect tyranny. Yeah. Okay. So, what I've been noticing lately, there's this new trend I've been noticing lately here in the summer that's taking place. And what I'm noticing is that when people will go into the store, they will leave their car running. So instead of turning off the car and going into the store and coming out and turning the car back on, they just leave the car running, presumably with the air conditioning on. Now, and I'm not talking about the times where this makes sense, like if you have a pet in the car or an elderly person in the car, or even if you're living in part of this country where it gets to be like 115 degrees. No, I'm talking about here in Pennsylvania where it gets to be about 80 degrees, maybe 90, 95. Yeah, it's warm, but it's not, this is not a summer that you're going to find close to the equator. You know, it's a hot summer, it's uncomfortable, but it's summer. You know, I'm talking about either there's no one in the car, or maybe there's like a teenager in the car, or just like a guy, you know, like a dad, like my age or younger. And they're just sitting in the car running with the AC on. You know, heaven forbid they're warm or uncomfortable for a few minutes or even a half an hour. You know, when I was growing up, this kind of thing just wasn't done. The idea that your parents would run into the store and leave the car running so that they could get back in a cool car, it's just not something that was done. You know, I waited in a hot car many a days with the windows rolled down in the summer while I was waiting for my parents growing up in Virginia. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that what's shocking to me, what never ceases to amaze me, is how America's addiction to comfort just manifests itself when I'm not expecting it. Like behaviors will just kind of pop up out of the blue, and I'll start to see things that just like, wow, we are, at some point we don't stop and go, maybe there's such a thing as too comfortable. Like maybe this isn't good for us. But we don't. And so this is a new thing. This is a thing. Leave the car running while you go into the store. Because heaven forbid you're uncomfortable. Heaven forbid your 15-year-old is uncomfortable for a few minutes. And heaven forbid you might have to suffer a hot car for a minute. You know, and anyway, so I was talking to one of my kiddos about this, and I was like, you know, it's not the, it's. I understand why. If you've seen any of my videos and you've been on my channel at all, I go into the metaphysical assumptions which underwrite government. I go into that, so I get it. I understand why America morphed from this sort of free and more or less libertarian kind of exercise in a government which exists to promote life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and has morphed into like this global totalitarian chaotic juggernaut. I get it. That doesn't surprise me. I understand why. I understand the metaphysics behind it. But it's always, nevertheless, it never ceases to amaze me the ways in which America's kind of cultural failure sort of manifests itself. I mean, I understand that and I mean this only clinically. I'm not saying this to be insulting, and I'm saying this only with respect to Americans as a type, not individuals necessarily, and certainly nobody that's listening to this. Because if you were listening to this, you can't possibly be this. You can't possibly be this American archetype. But Americans, you know, have become a nation of fat, lazy, stupid people. I mean, this is just what we are. We're morally bankrupt, culturally bankrupt, literally bankrupt, and no one seems to care. And I get this, and I know this, and I sort of understand why, but it never ceases to amaze me when it just pops up. It manifests itself in public right in my face. Like the guy pulls up next to me, gets out of his car, closes the door, leaves it running, and goes into Walmart. I'm just like going, there's nobody in this car. This car's empty. You mean you are so averse to being warm for like a minute. You don't want to be uncomfortable for a second longer than you absolutely have to. It never ceases to shock me. Now, I was explaining to one of my kiddos that the reason why we are where we are, Americans have become fat, lazy, stupid, and addicted to comfort to their own destruction, unfortunately, is not, this is the thing. The reason isn't in spite of what America is or was intended to represent, but the reason is because. what I was explaining is that if we don't understand that the manifestation of the cultural, intellectual, and moral atrophy we see in America now, if we don't understand that this is a product of America's roots and not something that has occurred in spite of it, then we will never be able to understand what's really going on and therefore never be able to find a solution for it. Now, I think that ship has sailed. I think America's done. This is the 10th generation of the American empire, and if you have studied empires in history, you know they last about 10 generations and then they collapse. And what do you know? Here we are. I mean, look at what America's doing overseas. World War III, anyone? So this makes sense to me. But what never stops amazing me is, again, how this sort of indolence manifests itself in public, and the fact that Americans seem incapable and utterly psychologically resistant to the understanding that the reason why we're here is because of what we are, not in spite of it. You know, we're told that the Constitution was perfect. It represents as close as man can get to a perfect utopia of individual liberty and freedom. And the Constitution was so wonderful. The checks and the balances and the states' rights and everything was meant to be a hedge against government overreach. It was perfect, but somehow, somewhere along the way, this is as Benjamin Franklin said, what did he say? A democracy or a free society if you can keep it. Somewhere along the way, someone came along, we elected the wrong people, or I don't know, some outside influence got to the people in charge and they screwed it all up for us. And that if we could just get back to the Constitution, everything would be perfect. But that's just not the case. That's the problem. That's the delusion. That's the American delusion, which is causing the problem. Is we're not here in spite of the Constitution. We're here because of it, because written into the Constitution, written into that program, was a sub-program or a more fundamental program called collectivist metaphysics, which over the years and over the decades has flourished and evolved and has given us what we have now. And the inability of Americans to cope, the inability of Americans to understand that what we see now America doing, both internally and externally, both with the Americans as a people in the country and what America's doing, the kind of moral atrocities it's promoting and perpetuating around the globe, the inability of people to recognize that this is an iteration of America, not of something in spite of America. And the more unhinged America gets in its dealings around the world and as a society itself, the more unhinged do the people who are watching, the Americans who are watching this, get, and the more they are trying to psychologically cope with what's going on. And you see this. Now, there's a couple of YouTube channels I watch. There's Judge Andrew Napolitano. There's his channel's called Judging Freedom. There is a channel called Dialogue Works. And you have these sort of baby boomer talking heads on there, people that had something to do either with the military or the government or intelligence, and they come on and they wax on about America's atrocities in the Middle East and with respect to Russia and Ukraine. And people like Colonel Larry Wilkerson, Larry Johnson, Scott Ritter. There's a couple of Russian guys, Dmitry Orlov, and another guy, I can't remember his name. And you know what they do? You can see the cope, and the way they're coping with this, you see, what's happening is the reality of what America is being dumped on their heads it's like this bucket of ice cold reality. And their brains just can't handle it. And so what they're doing is they're going to the favorite American boomer boogeyman, the Nazis. And what they're telling us is that, you see, the things that America's doing overseas, kinds of actions it's perpetuating and promoting, it's not something that Americans do, they say. This is what Nazis do. You see, this is Nazi behavior. And in Germany, according to Scott Ritter, you have actual Nazism on the rise. Germany, who has basically, my understanding, been a puppet of America since they lost the Second World War. So how on earth, you make a distinction between America and Germany, or America and Europe at all at this point, I think is kind of a stretch. But nevertheless, in Germany, you see actual Nazis, apparently. Like Germans now, because they're going along with the will of the American ruling class and continuing to saber rattle against Russia, have now become, the Nazis are rising again. So not only is America acting like Nazis, not only are Nazis channeling themselves and possessing the minds and bodies of American politicians, but now we have actual literal Nazis popping up again in Germany. And even Scott Ritter said yesterday, he said this, he goes, if you scratch a German, you'll find a Nazi underneath. That sounds like a fairly dramatic thing to say. You might be able to describe that as almost a genocidal statement. That is something that you couldn't say about any other group, I guess, except for Nazis, or apparently Germans, because if Scott Ritter had said, I don't know, scratch a Jew and you'll find a Zionist underneath. Scratch a black person, you find a gangster thug underneath. Scratch a woman, any woman, and you'll find a feminist underneath. We wouldn't be seeing much of Scott Ritter on YouTube anymore, but Scott goes, scratch a German and you find a Nazi, and his views will go up, and he will get more guest spots on more channels, because there's nothing that Americans like to do more and are more receptive to, particularly the baby boomers, than appealing to the Nazis as the sum and substance of everything wrong with what America's doing. My point in saying all this is this. This is the problem. Rather than look in the mirror and recognize the truth, which is this, what is really going on is that what's happening in Russia and Ukraine and Europe and China and the Middle East has nothing to do with the Nazis. It's American people and American politicians and American interests for American purposes. It's an American program. All of this is being done by and for America. There are no Nazis involved here. This is the thing. Everything being done is being done by America for American interests. They can't admit this to themselves. They have to believe it's really the Nazis. And this is because of the inability of the American people, and particularly these kinds of people in the baby boomer generation, to really be able to sort of examine their own self. It's easier to blame the Nazis than to look in the mirror. If they really spent any time kind of examining America and examining what it stands for and what it was going to be and what it actually says it exists to promote in the founding documents, you could understand why it would become this. And maybe at this point you could recognize the real problem instead of blaming it on this make-believe boogeyman called the Nazis. You might actually be able to see the real problem and do something about it, but they can't. They can't. So this is where we are. Now, moving on to America, I'm going to tell you what America is. And I wrote an article a couple of years ago called America, the Perfect Tyranny, and rather than being less apt now than it was then, it's actually more apt now than it was then, I would argue. So I'm going to read you this article, and I'm going to explain to you what America represented, and from this, why we can see America doing what it's doing now. And understand that what's going on is not the Nazis doing it, it's America doing it for American reasons and American purposes. So, this is called America, the Perfect Tyranny. Now, I'm going to get very metaphysical here. We're going to talk about the roots of government, the why of government existence, the assumptions about the nature of man, upon which government is erected. We're going to talk about collectivist metaphysics and individualist metaphysics. It's important to understand this. All governments, every single one without exception, are rooted in collectivist metaphysics. Collectivism has a very specific interpretation of the individual. The individual defined by the state, no matter what state it is, America or otherwise, is going to have a collectivist definition. And that is going to be the definition that the state is working with. So when it talks about acting in service to the individual, it is that collectivist definition of the individual that it is working from, period. Individualist metaphysics have their own definition of the individual, which is entirely different and mutually exclusive of the collectivist definition. Okay? So, with that in mind, I'm going to read my article and then I will be done. Okay, this is America, the Perfect Tyranny. On its current course, this grand American experiment, which is inflicted upon all Americans, willing and unwilling, can only end one way. You see, the purpose of the Western liberal state, the United States being prime example number one, and a purpose of which most of us are only obtusely aware, or not at all, because it is only implicit in the premise upon which this nation was built, yet is nevertheless supremely fundamental. Anyway, the purpose of the Western liberal state, and again America being prime example number one, is to manifest chaos, and chaos as an ideal. It does this and has done this by first blurring, then destroying the line between fantasy and reality, between the empirical and the abstract, until all meaning is erased, and existence is nothing more than a hedonistic, wet dream for the ruling class, and a perpetual existential nightmare for the rest of us. The masses will have no means nor impetus to resist or reject this, because all meaning shall be expurgated, then obliterated. Even today, observe the contradiction in cognitive dissonance. There are no sexes and no genders, but there are races. Capitalism is evil, but billionaires own the law and use their wealth to casually assume great swaths of power. Words are violence, but wars are justice. Lives are sacred in a pandemic, but political and disposable in pregnancy. Gas pipelines are oppressive, but lithium mines are green. Welcome to the American ideal of chaos. You see what I mean? Chaos, meaninglessness, contradiction, systemic cognitive dissonance, all leading to obedience without thought. Meaning that the masses obey without ever realizing that they are obeying, because they are no longer capable of knowing the difference between obedience and liberty. How did we get here? This is not an accident, not a political or societal wrong turn, not the concerted and subversive efforts of non-natives, at least not these things fundamentally. No, this is constitutional, meaning if you read the United States Constitution, the zenith of enlightened liberalism, or rather read between the lines, you understand that it was always going to go this way. It's in the premise, and the premise always finds its conclusion. So what do I mean? The unique point of the American political system was to treat the individual as his own root political entity, a single or singular political unit. Now, indeed, this is what he is, but this can only be rationally manifest in a purely voluntary society, where cooperation, not coercion, is the means of all social and political interactions. But the United States is not a cooperative society. It's not voluntarist. It is a state. That is, its citizens are governed, meaning they are ruled. Being ruled means to be under the authority of the law, and government is law. Law is authority, and authority is force. That's the political equation of every nation and every state and every tribe on earth since the dawn of humanity. So what do we get when we have a citizen who is his own individual political entity, yet who is governed by the state? And by state, we mean the ruling class. And by ruling class, we mean the small group of people who presume the natural right to coerce others into obedience to the law, which finds its purpose and efficacy and meaning entirely in the state, which is, of course, convenient for the ruling class. What we have is an attempt to collectively legislate individuality. In other words, to collectively govern millions of politically distinct individual entities, to centralize individuality. In short, to integrate collectivist metaphysics and individualist metaphysics, which are, of course, mutually exclusive in nature. Now, without going into too much tedious detail regarding metaphysics, which I do in many other posts on this channel, the only outcome of this attempt to synthesize individuality with collectivism is, or individualist metaphysics with collectivist metaphysics, is chaos. The purely individual man is governed only by himself, meaning individual as defined by individualist metaphysics. The purely individual man is governed only by himself, and with respect to other men, he cooperates. Okay? There is no ruling class who has authority over him, and such things as ruling classes and governments and law and authority are purely functions of collectivist metaphysics, which are entirely antithetical to his individual and individualist nature. Now, understanding that in a cooperative society, you have to understand that cooperative or voluntary society or stateless society operate according to a fundamental metaphysical definition of the individual. This has an objective epistemological definition, or this metaphysical definition or interpretation of the individual, according to the individualist metaphysics of a voluntarist society, has an objective epistemological and ethical value, okay? Which, without getting into too much detail, means that as soon as somebody in that voluntarist society violates his neighbor by theft or fraud or murder, etc., the perpetrator of such evil has implicitly, if not explicitly, rejected himself as an individual. So in order to violate your neighbor, you would have had to reject the definition of your own individual self, which means that to the greater society, you no longer represent an individual, and therefore you may be dealt with as the threat you are. So, in a voluntarist or cooperative society, it is not possible for evil to flourish because there is an objective rationale which underwrites the removing those elements from the society. So whether it's incarceration or whether they have to be destroyed, the idea that in a cooperative or voluntarist society, people are at the mercy of other people's random whim is simply untrue. Voluntarist and cooperative societies act or function according to specific metaphysical definition of the individual, which implies an objective epistemological and ethical value, which is rejected as soon as someone violates his neighbor, which means the neighbors or the society is not obligated to deal with them any longer as an individual, but they have now become a threat. And that threat shall either be destroyed or in some other sense expurgated. Okay? But that's how ethics in an individual society operates, without going into too much detail. So when we attempt to legislate the politically autonomous individual from a collectivist authority outside of him, that is, we attempt to thrust individuality upon him by the coercive power of the state, we destroy meaning at its root on a holistically societal scale. When we attempt to thrust individuality upon the individual citizen, when we attempt to force his root nature upon him from outside of him, we are attempting to manifest a contradiction, to make a square circle, as the old but apt cliche goes. The outcome will be chaos, which at first will look like hedonism for the masses, then it will become the enslavement of the masses to feed the hedonism of the ruling class. The final stage, of course, is the obvious and inevitable collapse of the state, with the ruling class bitterly fighting amongst and devouring itself, before finally sinking into its self-inflicted black hole of contradiction. And let's just hope that when this happens to America, as it inevitably will, it doesn't take the rest of the planet with it. But that remains to be seen. I gotta step out. I gotta get a sweater. I'm getting chilly, or I need to get like something to wear over my tank top. So hold on a second. I'll be right back. All right, I'm back. Sorry about that. Okay. Now, about hedonism here. I'm going to get a drink here. Okay, hedonism, which is simply the practical application of moral relativism, will be the only thing that the government, from its purely collectivist roots, can recognize as being that which is actually individualistic. In other words, when the government thinks individuality, or in political parlance, individual rights, it thinks hedonism, even if only implicitly or tacitly so, even if only subconsciously so. And from its inexorable collectivist metaphysical roots, it can only think hedonism. And by hedonism, I mean people doing whatever they want without moral consequence. And that's by hedonism. So people doing whatever they want without moral consequence, which can include the violation of one's neighbor, and however you want to define that. Fraud, murder, theft, etc. You see, individuality, according to the collectivist metaphysical assumptions upon which the state is founded, again means people doing whatever they want without moral consequence, which inevitably leads to hedonism, self-indulgence at the expense of one's neighbor. Okay, so this is how collectivist metaphysics defines the individual. Collectivist metaphysics, upon which all governments are based, defines the individual, you, yourself qua self, you from your conscious existential frame of reference, as being utterly insufficient to the apprehension of truth and acting in service to it, which means if left to yourself, you will get only moral chaos, moral atrocity, which is why men must be governed. This is why governments are established. Collectivist metaphysics identifies and defines the individual as one who cannot act in service to truth and apprehend it on his own, in his natural state, as an individual, and therefore will become self-centered, immoral, or unethical, and hedonistic. That's the definition of individuality from which every government is operating, because every government operates upon collectivist metaphysical principles. So when a government exists to promote the individual or individual rights, what are they actually, if only tacitly, promoting? Exactly. This is America. You see? This is America, specifically established to promote the individual. They thought that meant freedom, liberty, happiness, but that's not what it means, because that can't be what it means, because it's coming from the government. And the government is rooted in collectivist metaphysics, which only defines the individual as one way. So if the government's going to give the individual his freedom, this is what the government's going to promote. Not this kind of liberty and moral utopia that we were told it was supposed to be, but no, the kind of moral relativism, hedonism, and moral atrocity and chaos that we are now seeing. This is what America exists to manifest, to promote, by appealing to its desire to promote individual freedom and rights. Okay? Now, this is a tough pill to swallow. I know. I'm not saying it's being done consciously, but it doesn't have to be. America operates on a premise, a metaphysical premise. It runs in the background. It's a metaphysical assumption, runs in the background. It's subconscious, but it's there. And that premise is what's leading to the conclusion. That's why America's doing what it's doing. Individuality, according to the collectivist metaphysical assumptions upon which the state is founded, means, again, people doing whatever they want without moral consequence. Indeed, this is always the single most oft-cited argument in favor of the establishment of states or governments. Without the government, we are told people will do whatever they want without consequence, and this inevitably implies a grand orgy of self-indulgent atrocity and the necessary extinction of the human race. Government, you see, according to its collectivist metaphysics, exists precisely because humanity is by nature, in the iteration of self-aware individuals, insufficient to its own very existence. Government exists for you as an individual because you can't exist without it. You see, you as a conscious self are incapable of apprehending the truth and acting in service to it, which means if left to yourself, there's going to be an orgy of moral atrocity, hedonism, and sin, and then you die and the race dies with it. The only way humanity can survive is if it is governed. This is the collectivist metaphysics of the individual. Okay? So governments are established to be man for him, to make sure that man can actually exist. Because man qua man on himself is insufficient to it. That's why he must be governed. Okay? So, in other words, government then becomes you effectively for you. It is your ability to be, and therefore it owns you. And this is why all governments, no matter how enlightened they may be, all become tyrannical unless they are conquered or collapsed somehow before. Government is not for the people. It owns them. It dispenses with the notion of individuality because to the collectivist roots of government, individuality is an object lie. Individual consciousness is a fraud. It's an impostor to reality. Without the ruling class making rules and enforcing them by violence and threats of violence, the individual will destroy himself. His existence on its own is implied non-existence. The individual then, if ungoverned, is a walking, talking contradiction. You can't exist. You are insufficient to your existence in and of yourself qua self. This is why governments are established. This is the metaphysics of government. Man must be governed. He must be controlled because his consciousness, the thing which makes man man, is insufficient. It's anathema to reality. It's insufficient for man's own existence. Therefore, he must be coerced by the state. Okay? Now, along comes America. America says, well, you know what? We think we can legislate in favor of the individual rather than all the other governments before. All of the other governments which have said we have a ruling class and the people must do what we say, we must obey the king, must obey the emperor, we must obey the leadership, because you need us, because without us you're just lost sheep in the wilderness. America's going to come along and we're going to be special. We're going to be different. We're going to say, no, no, no. The masses are what it matters. The masses are good. The masses of people, they're all individuals and they matter and they have value. And we're going to do something different because we're Americans and we're better and we're special. We're going to square the circle. We're going to establish a government, but it's not going to be to control the people. It's going to be to set them free. So we're going to have a government that doesn't coerce and conquer the individual, but promotes the individual, legislates for him, for the individual himself. And we're going to have this free, perfect, beautiful, liberal, libertarian utopia of free individuals doing what individuals want to do, and it's going to be great. And the reason why is because our founding fathers were just so smart. They made the Constitution, and it's perfect. Look, it's perfect. Checks and balances. What else do you need? We got checks and balances, bro. Checks and balances. We got this. We squared the circle. We turned lead into gold. We're Americans. We're great. Aren't we great? We're not going to do those stupid totalitarian kings and monarchies and no. We're going to be representative. We're going to legislate not to conquer or control the individual. We're going to set them free. Government's going to exist to set the individual free. That's America. That's American, man. This is why what's going on now has to be the Nazis. It's got to be the Nazis, right? Because this is not America's freedom, individual, love, peace, man. America can never become this. We're special. We're different. We're great. We're the shining city on the hill. We're God's favorite nation. Okay, so that's what America did. America came along and said, no. We're going to legislate we're going to govern in the interest of the individual. We're no longer going to recognize that the individual is insufficient to his own existence and must be controlled. We're going to control him in a way that sets him free. Never mind that's a contradiction totally. 2 + 2 is 5, square in the circle, up is down, whatever. America's special, so they can do it. Okay, so this is what its premise is. This was America. This is what it was supposed to be. So, now consider this. Okay, so we know why government exists. We know what it was there for. Now America comes along and says that they're going to somehow square this circle. So, consider the utterly ironic and counterintuitive notion of a government then. Okay, in light of what I just said, what government is predicated upon, usually, America comes along and says, no, we're going to have a government by the people and for the people. Okay? And by people, we mean individuals. So, and the people are, in the Lockean sense, self-contained individual political units. So what we have here in America is we're going to establish a government that attempts to deny its own metaphysical roots, and instead of rejecting individuality like all governments prior, attempts to legislate individuality, to make individuality a matter of law, of force, of coercion. The government, ironically, will attempt to force or will force the individual into freedom? What if there are enough Enlightenment philosophers around doing enough work and being persuasive enough to convince a set of wealthy would-be ruling class landowners to establish a nation based upon the principle that the government's responsibility is to make individuality the fundamental objective of the collective law? You see here, America is an attempt to synthesize the collectivist metaphysics of the state with individualist metaphysics. And what you are going to get is a disaster of epic proportions. It is the perfect storm of political totalitarian tyranny and chaos. Did you ever see the movie The Perfect Storm? That's what America is. The perfect storm. This is what makes America special. This is what makes it special. But it's not special in a good way, as you are now seeing. Look around. So, the result of this kind of thinking, would be, so I said the government, imagine enough Enlightenment philosophers around doing enough work and being persuasive enough to convince a set of wealthy would-be ruling class landowners to establish a nation based upon the principle that the government's responsibility is to make individuality the fundamental objective of the collective law. The result of this would be a disaster of epic proportions. It would be the perfect tyranny. And you'll get that line if you watch the movie The Perfect Storm. So the government is going to force you by law to accept the right of people to be an individual. Now, understand, the definition of individual is going to be the collectivist definition, because that's the only definition that a government can work off of. If the government were to acknowledge the individual according to individualist metaphysics, it would have to abolish itself. The first act of government would be abolish itself, because the government cannot recognize the individual in the individualistic sense, only the collectivist sense. So if the government is going to coerce and force upon society by law individuality, it's going to force a version of the individual according to the collectivist definition. So the government's going to force the people by law to accept the right of people to do whatever they want, where whatever they want can only ever be according to the immutable and inexorable collectivist metaphysics upon which all governments, including the American government, are founded, defined as the right of people to indulge their rank hedonistic desires. Now, it's not sold to the masses this way. It is tacitly, though. We're supposed to accept all manner of aberrant behavior as normal and right and good, and whatever people do in the privacy of their home is perfectly acceptable. You can have no moral judgments about what another person does as long as it's legal. So there's a tacit promotion of this kind of thing, but it's never outright stated the way I'm stating it. But it's sold officially to the masses as freedom and life, liberty, property, natural rights. All men are created equal. Who are you to judge? There's no one right way of being and acting and behaving and thinking. And all other things, right? So even the ruling class, and this is something, I'm not even saying, this is not something that's even being consciously done. The ruling class is doing this, even the ruling class, the members of the government that have the best intentions, they're still operating on the fundamental collectivist program which underwrites government. You can't get away from it. As soon as you are a ruler, one of the rulers or one of the ruled, you are going to operate and exist according to collectivist metaphysics. That's the system. That's the matrix you're in, and you cannot get out of it. No matter what you want or your best of intentions, humans function according to assumptions. The only way to change the outcome is to change the assumption. And you can't change the assumption if you're going to blame the Nazis every time America does something that America wants to do for American reasons that doesn't work out. You'll blame on the Nazis instead of America. The Nazi boogeymen, the Nazi phantoms that are somehow flying around the sky and possessing people in the West at random, right? According to apparently Scott Ritter. So if the government exists to promote individuality, and the kind of individuality is the kind of individuality that collectivist metaphysics describes as why human beings can't be left to themselves and must be governed, what kind of society do you think you're going to see as this political ideology begins to evolve over time? Chaos? Perhaps contradiction, doublespeak, moral relativism, the death of meaning, the death of objectivity, scientific determinism, the rejection of the consciousness, there's no such thing as you or self, you're not really here, you're just a meat puppet, that kind of thing, maybe? Atheistic nihilism, maybe that kind of thing? What do you think you're going to get when this kind of political thinking evolves over time? Well, that's what you're going to get. Exactly. Chaos, contradiction, doublespeak, moral relativism, the death of meaning, the death of objectivity, naturally. And what's the inevitable outcome of all this? Mass psychosis, a society-wide death cult, destruction, collapse, power-mongering, bloodlust, war-mongering, totalitarianism? Certainly. The scary thing is that you'll likely never even notice the perfect tyranny, because it's the tyranny that tells you that you get to do whatever you want. And that feels so good and so free and so right. And if they can keep you fat and lazy and stupid enough for long enough and addicted to comfort, to the point where you're leaving your car running while you run into Walmart for a half an hour because you have to come back to a cool car. You wouldn't want to be hot for a minute. So if they can keep you fat and lazy and stupid enough for long enough, then you won't realize until it's too late that when people are governed in order that they may do whatever they want, in the hedonistic sense, someone is going to want to commit murder, and therefore someone is going to be the victim. And the state, being obligated to do so, will start to look around for a politically convenient someone to be that victim. And eventually, somewhere, after the babies and the school children and the elderly are thrown upon Moloch's altar, that someone will be you, and worse, that will be someone you love. So if you want to know why America's doing what it's doing, you can stop blaming the Nazis, and you can start putting the blame where it needs to be, on America. American interest, American reasons, and American ideals. So that's all I have to say, and I hope this was enlightening. I hope you got something out of this. I hope it wasn't too convoluted or tedious, but thank you to anybody who's listening or watching. I do appreciate you being here, even if it's just a couple of you. And yeah, I hope you got something out of this. So yeah, that's all I have to say. I know I said I wasn't going to upload, but I felt like I should upload this today, so I did. I know in the last video I said I might be done, but I don't know. Maybe I just won't do one every day, but I'll do one whenever I feel like it. Like today, I felt like this is something important to talk about, so I did. So stay tuned if you're interested in this kind of thing, and if you want to be kept updated, you can like and subscribe, as they say. And yeah. All right, I guess that's it, and have a great day, evening, morning, whatever, and I'll talk to you later. Okay, take care. Bye.